When one spends so long looking at the stars, then over time, they may forget what the ground looks like. Welcome back. I've been reading over the responses from my previous videos, and I've been going over feedback, so keep at it. However, one thing in particular caught my attention. The tiny little detail I made in one of my videos about how time flows more slowly in the Bronze Age world. Now, I don't blame this person. In fact, such a thing is difficult for historians to comprehend, let alone us laymen. While I feel the answer is pretty loud and clear that you want me to do a discussion regarding the spirits in the world of Exalted, I feel the need to go down even further to one of the very roots of Exalted itself. Mortals. Why is such a thing important? This is because despite everything about the game of Exalted, from tales of epic heroism to fighting up horrors that exist beyond the veil of creation and time itself, mortals are still the center of Exalted. The vast majority of the Exalted themselves were once mortal. The majority of the people your characters will interact with will very likely be mortal. The vast majority of people you will rule or trade with will be mortal. Playing the game without knowing mortals, I feel, is a major stumbling block, akin to making a house without a foundation. One of the previous developers of Exalted 3rd Edition named Holden believed an Exalted setting without interesting mortals is destined for failure. And in order to get into that mindset of a Bronze Age mortal, and not just Exalted, but a magical world, some things may need explaining. In this case today, we hang up our shiny demigod cloaks and don the mantle of the humble mortal. I'll be going in depth to talk about many of the things we take for granted in real life today. The first part of this episode is going to be a brief reading list of supplementary literature I feel not only fits the topic of the episode, but also the tone of a game for a mortal. The second part of the episode will go over the life of a mundane mortal in the Bronze Ages, sticking closely to the mundane as possible. In part 3, we'll look at the supernatural and how that plays into a mortal's life, which is going to be fairly drastic when compared to our Bronze Ages. Before we begin, I want to say that I know many of the things said here will vary quite differently from culture to culture and place to place, just as it did throughout history. In fact, saying it will vary differently is an understatement. It will vary drastically. However, even in creation, I'm willing to believe that many of the places follow the same structure and patterns as so long as people are not nomadic in nature. An Ice Walker tribe is going to have a far different life than even their Hazlanti counterparts. So keep in mind, much of what I say here is going to be information in general, rather than gospel spread across all of creation uniformly. For those watching the video, the game I'm playing today is Yo-Yo Kengeki Muso, or otherwise known as Dat Yamu Sword Game. A little short, but still fun. Without delay, let's jump right into it. Part 1. Supplementary Literature. As expected, main gameline books are often your best bets to learn more in depth about the setting itself. And the world of mortals are no different. Now, each book does have some tidbits on what a mortal life is like, but some books I feel do a far more effective job on whenever it be through evocative writing, the book purposely focusing on mortals, or a combination of both. In what I've read of the first edition, the excellent Solar Cast books and Dragon-Blooded Aspect books are more focused towards Solars and Dragon-Blooded, but also give some more tidbits on what an everyday mortal life is like, and also what a Solar's life is like when they were still mortal themselves. Manacle and Coin, also from first edition, is a book talking about some of the far dirtier aspects for mortal life and trade. I find it is worth a read, but I feel it is overly cynical. It does paint a very dark and black view of creation, which I give props to as people generally tend to shy away from such material. But I think it does go a bit too far. It also goes against one of the core tenets of what I believe to be Exalted, the weaving of the supernatural and the natural into one cohesive whole. If you do read this book, feel free to completely ignore the bits of the guild and mortals trying to stay out of supernatural affairs, as this goes against the core assumptions of the edition it was written for, let alone later editions. In the second edition, we have the Squirrel Kings and Masters of Jade. If you ask the community about Squirrel Kings, you'll likely hear less than enthusiastic responses. In fact, many people would sooner spit on it than glance in its general direction. This is because the main gripe of the book is the horrible handling of the mechanics. Which is true, they're garbage. But mechanics today isn't our focus, so what about its fluff chapters? I feel it follows the trend of most pre-Glories Exalted 2nd edition books. That is, books written before Glories of the Most High. The language inside of these books are very technical. They don't do a good job as inspiring imaginations, but they do get the raw facts and information across efficiently. Like seriously, I have sociological school textbooks that are more evocative than these things. Masters of Jade is an entirely different kettle of fish. While it is strictly a 2nd edition book, for all intents and purposes, it might as well be 3rd edition. Information is presented in a way that does not only inform, but fuels the imagination. It doesn't give the same breadth of knowledge that the highly technical 2nd edition manuals give you, but it gives you enough to try and let your mind wander and fill those details in yourself. In fact, the subsystem of the creation ruling mandate in the back of the book still works in 3rd edition if you want to replace the leadership system. It may be a little gamey for simulating proper court protocol, we may not have charms beyond excellencies for it, but at this point, even writing down random outcomes and throwing darts blindly at them is better than the leadership system that we currently have presented in 3rd edition. But don't take my word for it. Go ahead and ask some of the more experienced 3rd edition players that you might know of online. Chances are, I'm willing to bet, that they'll have similar responses. As a shameless plug, you can also use my Creation's Badass Overlords subsystem that combines the best aspects of both the creation ruling mandates and the Exalted 3rd Edition's social systems. Link down below in the description. There's also the compasses in Exalted 2nd Edition as well. Again, they're largely dry, but they're fairly well informative. They do touch lightly on mortals, I feel, but they're mostly focused on how to appeal to the Exalted and the supernatural themselves. Still, I recommend reading them though. The 1st edition books also have fluff pieces as well, which are largely more evocative, so go ahead and give those a read as well. As for 3rd edition, there isn't any mortal-specific books at the current time of this video. The only things remotely close are the cultural locales in the Lunar's book. I'm not going to speculate what this could or could not be, so we'll just need to wait and see what the future has in store for us. Now how about game books outside the Exalted line itself? Well, there's one excellent book I know of just for this. A Magical Medieval City Guide by Expeditious Retreat Press is a D20 book, meaning it was written for Dungeons & Dragons first and foremost. While there may be some minor differences between that of Western medieval Europe and Creation, and also has casual mentions to spells such as Create Food and items such as Decanter of Endless Water, it nonetheless serves as an utterly fantastic guide to what an old-fashioned society was like. From details about how lords govern the lands to even the basic daily life of a typical peasant, but more importantly, the social obligations of each one. It does break down when you start analyzing the exact minute differences between Creation and Western medieval Europe, but I feel it still holds up largely true for the majority of mortals in Creation who live in some form of city or community. Things are very different when you're an Exalt, but then again, how much would your personal life change if you won the lottery? For all purposes of this book, feel free to ignore the second half of it, as it only talks about city generation. I mean, unless you want to use it. I mean, I'm not gonna stop you. I'm not a cop. Now regarding outside of RPGs, things become a bit easier. Pick up any history book. TV shows could work, but if you want to know what a peasant life is like, then be a bit more picky with material. A lot of history books, I feel, focus on great people or major events, and less so about the people trampled upon them. Sure, we know all about the reign of Caesar or Augustus, but how about some of the finer points of typical lives back then? Did you know that Roman brothels actually had sexual positions laid out in front of a client, so they'd know exactly what kind of service they wanted to order, like a fast food restaurant today? Or did you know that bored soldiers doodle penis scribbles on the wall when they are bored at their shift? It just goes to show that some things haven't changed even thousands of years later. Or how about even the amount of work or things soldiers had to do behind the scenes, such as hunt for food? For a brief primer on this, check out Everyday Moments in History, A Roman Soldier Prepares Dinner, link down below. After watching it, the most impressive thing for hearing large battles in history for me wasn't the hundreds of ships loaded with thousands upon thousands of soldiers that impressed me, but rather how they actually supplied such things. And for the history buffs out there likely watching this, yes, I am well aware that there are books in history talking about what a peasant's life was like. However, I feel they're a bit more uncommon compared to the rest of them. So please, don't rip my head off. In terms of entertainment mediums, then you come to the right time. The isekai genre is still in the boom period, and while there's quite a bit of... Okay, there's a lot of really shitty isekais out there, but some gems exist. The grittier ones that focus more so on society, rather than overpowered wish fulfillment heroes, are some of my personal favorites. The manga Ascendance of a Bookworm, I feel, describes the life and trials of a typical peasant family in a strange yet familiar world. It goes into great detail about how we take things for granted today are a luxury in the medieval world, and just how much effort it takes to replicate something that we widely take for granted today. A place where most peasants have little idea about magic. In fact, in the manga, doesn't even show actual magic until a little over 20 chapters in. In fact, I have to come clean and admit that I am now an isekai addict. Damn you straight to hell, Assy. Damn you for making my Firefox have over 30 tabs of manga devoted to isekai at any one given time. It's bad enough that I have a Toho addiction already. Then there's also the more popular mediums such as Game of Thrones, which at this point I think everyone on the planet already knows of. There's also lesser known books such as Memoirs of a Geisha, which I admit it's been a long time since I read, but it's still a good book and I recommend checking that one out. In terms of philosophy and root belief in the Bronze Ages, I'd have to pick Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince, which, in spite of being written hundreds of years ago, is still pretty spot on about things. Now, Machiavelli may sound like an asshole throughout the entire book. After all, with lines such as, quote, "If an injury has to be done to a man, it should be done so severe that his vengeance need not be feared," one cannot help but think Machiavelli is a cynical asshole. But I do not think this is his point. Machiavelli, in my perspective, is sort of a realist. Many other philosophers tend to refuse some sort of common goodness in man with some other epistemological reason. Machiavelli looks at them and goes, "That's not how things actually work in the real world. Here, let me tell you how they work." Which I believe most people in a medieval Bronze Age would innately try to go for, whenever it be higher realms of reasoning or, more likely, simple peasant lifestyles. I do not think Machiavelli's ideal ruler is a ruthless tyrant of a king. Far from it. I believe his ideal king is a clever king, one with a silk glove in one hand and a sword in the other, knowing when and not afraid to use either one. Deception and brute force go hand in hand with sincerity and kindness. You just need to know when to use both. Now I know philosophy might be more than what some of you signed up for, so if you don't want to read the entire book, I'd recommend reading some of the more juicier quotes from the book. I put a list of the quotes down in the links below. Of course, there are other philosophical works that I believe go with Exalted as well. Plays of the Republic form the basis of how the Exalted First Age worked in regards to the proposed caste system. Leviathan by Mr. Life is Nasty, Brutish, and Short by Hobbes, Sun Tzu, The Art of War, which is still being used by military generals today, and the Chinese philosophy of Confucius, and much more. But if I went on about such things, then we'd just be here all day. So rather than be here all day, let's just go ahead and jump into part 2. What life is like for an everyday mortal in the Bronze Ages. Part 2. Life as a mortal in the Bronze Ages. Now, as a minor warning, I'm going to temporarily ignore what I said one of the core tenets of Exalted is, the fusion of the mythical and the mundane, and focus exclusively on the mundane part here. While the supernatural and the natural being tied together is not only a strong core component of Exalted, but many fantasy worlds, you need to realize that not all mortals will interact with the mythical or the supernatural on a daily basis. In fact, our goal here is to draw out what life is like for a mortal without the blessings of the divine itself. So we're not going to touch this part, the supernatural part, unless absolutely necessary, which is good, as sometimes really bad things happen to mortals whenever Exalted goes oops. So let's give the poor mortals a reprieve from that. We have a lot to cover in this section, and by a lot, I mean I'm trying to condense a very large library, including Bronze Age life, into a small sliver of a video. But what I consider the most important part is calling into question a lot of things you take granted today. Things that are invisible to you, and you might not even know about until they're mentioned, but are actually extremely important for the massive impact they have on our everyday lives. One such example, literacy. Such a thing today is considered to be important nearly universally across the globe itself. According to a quick Google search, our modern literacy rate is 86% of the people in the world. Even corruption-filled dictatorships, such as North Korea, have programs to enhance state literacy these days. But back in the Bronze Ages, I can't find data going back that far, but in 1800, it was estimated that only 12% of the people in the world were literate. Such a thing, I feel, is hard to even contemplate for many people today. But consider the opposite. Why is there the need for such widespread literacy in the Bronze Ages? What need does your average peasant farmer have for reading or writing? When a simple piece of parchment could easily cost an entire week's worth of labor, how does knowing such a thing benefit your task of plowing the field, hunting for animals, blacksmithing, or preparing dinner? The same could be said for math itself. A majority of people would likely got lost if some value went beyond the fingers on both their hands. So a gut feeling combined with the barter system typically replaced for a need of such role. It wasn't something like a talent of silver for 5 oxen, but rather, quote, how many carrots, kegs of booze, personal favors are 5 oxen worth? People would give an opening offer for something, then haggling would often begin from there on out. If by any chance you needed something read or written down, then get the services of your local scribe, a person whose only job might be to read and write things. While nobles or wealthy merchants may be able to read or write themselves, a scribe might be needed to verify letters of introduction to lords within the regions, or specially training a guard to be able to at least read and write names or recognize various family seals. Now the question here is, why wasn't there a more widespread effort in order to spread the gift of literacy across the world? After all, there could be nothing to benefits for such a thing, right? Not as much as you might think. An illiterate population is more than likely going to be an uneducated population, one that is easier to both control and easier to suppress. There's also the cost of education and supplies in order to do it, and paper didn't come cheap back then. If you really want to trace such things back, you'll end up an endless maze of prerequisites needed in order to pull off such a thing, such as universal literacy. And I just don't mean the physical aspect of making a printing press, but rather the sociological factors in play too, such as the culture and the status quo. In fact, the more I read about ancient cultures, the more I wonder how society managed to break away from such things. But I'm getting way ahead of myself, so let's take a step back to address another thing we take for granted today. Knowledge. As I mentioned in my last video, knowledge was slower back in the Middle Ages. Not only just reading, but even news involving 2 towns over could take days or possibly even weeks to learn about. And even then, would you really care about such information if it didn't involve your town or close family? In fact, a current Sunday edition newspaper in our modern society contains more information than a typical peasant would learn in their entire lifetime. Let that sink in for a moment. Let it sink in that yes, we still actually have newspapers at the time of this video. There is one reason why books were so rare and valuable in such times. Books were a thing for the extremely rich, things that needed to be copied by hand, bound, and protected against the elements in a time where housing and protection was questionable at best. Those who had the ability to read books and absorb the knowledge within them were seen with an otherworldly quality. A typical scholar might not have read a single book, but multiple books. Such a person tended to have an otherworldly sort of quality or aspect to them. A person capable of talking about so much material, so complex and obtuse, they might as well be speaking another language. and in many cases often can, or not only can describe a location several towns over, but quite possibly on the other side of the world. This can often lead to the belief that the First Age or the Shogunate in Exalted were often seen with the mystique of a lost age, such as Rome was in the Middle Ages. Rome was seen as the height of humanity back then. The philosophy, the society, the culture, the technology, all were pined for back in the Middle Ages, much like the First Age or the Shogunate was in Exalted. You know the fantasy cliche of a classical wizard reading tomes of knowledge in his tower for lost secrets? Such a trope was applied back to the monks and scholars in the Middle Ages, doing everything they could to glean knowledge of a golden age long since faded, and preserving the knowledge of what they do know. In fact, if you use Masters of Jade as an example, the Guild's empire was all started when the Guild's founder simply read a book about economic policies and the theories about the markets in the First Age. This is not a misdemeanor. If someone with today's market knowledge got transported back to the Bronze Ages and weren't killed by some random bandit, disease, or enslaved, then they could quite easily make a fortune beyond our wildest dreams. Was it because people were dumber back then? Good heavens, no. A peasant back then may be as sharp as a person from today's time, but what they're robbed of is not only opportunities to learn, but mindsets themselves. Think about the scientific method we currently use today to determine scientific knowledge. Again, this is something we take for granted, and it seems so incredibly simple to the point where even a grade schooler can understand it. But back in the past, this wasn't always the case. It wasn't until Francis Bacon in the mid-1500s started complaining about this, saying that in order to break out of the Dark Ages humanity found itself in, a more reliable method of learning and knowledge needed to be found. He pined for a better way for people to research new information in a more efficient manner, and ended up later developing the scientific method. Hindsight is 20/20, but can cause our perception of what we think back then to be blurry. Take the thought processes that led to the Industrial Revolution, for example. What was the start-off point or points for that? You can maybe point to a specific person in history of when they accomplished this, but what led to the mindset of standardization and mass production? This is also what I feel was a curse for the Exalted and the Solars themselves. They didn't naturally go through the tech levels like they did in our world. They basically went from making their boats out of wood to indestructible materials with almost no in-between. Such a thing sounds impossible, but we're talking about people who can be double the intelligence of Einstein or Stephen Hawking. This not only led to a near collapse of civilization when nearly all of your wonders are made or maintained by a single group of people, but makes it so that when it does collapse, there isn't much to go back to when you're finished. That is, when you collapse, you don't go back to the Industrial Age. You're gonna fall right back to the Stone Age, or Bronze Age, if you're not careful. You could say that the players could usher in such things, such as using the rationale of because they're player characters, but I'll leave that to the individual storytellers to decide on their own. Such a thing is often equivalent to the discussions in Dungeons & Dragons on whenever the PCs can invent modern firearms or not, which I'm going to steer well clear of for the sake of my own sanity. If you're new to RPGs and want to see what an endless dumpster fire is like, go ahead and track down such discussions. Sidetracked again, so let's get back on track with some different topics. Cleanliness and sanitation. Did you know back in the medieval ages, big cities were typically vile and disgusting places? I don't mean metaphorically, I mean it quite literally. Modern sewage isn't a thing back then, so most people use chamber pots at night and then throw them out the window come morning. Want fresh water? Then you gotta make your trip down to your local well, river, or fountain and lug all of that life-giving liquid right back to your home. People didn't wash hands often. In fact, bathing in general was largely unknown of in high society, where people often used strong perfumes in lieu of bathing. With no common cleanliness, disease was not only common, but rampantly spread through a city, becoming a plague when such a thing happened. Even things such as clean water are often taken for granted today. Many cultures often mix tiny bits of alcohol into all their water in order to make it safer to drink. And let's just say their water was a bit more of a brown color than the crystal clear liquid most of us take for granted today. Just to give you an idea of how all this adds up, nearly 1 in every 3 people died in 18th century England just due to illness alone. This is often why parents had so many kids back then. It was in order to make sure that at least one of them would make it to adulthood. That is one of the reasons why people often stayed in the countryside. With proper places to take your waste, it was often far cleaner. The spread out houses slightly reduced the risk of fire and disease, and the chances of starving to death was much less, as you either owned a farm or very likely knew someone who did. A large part of this was also with how largely self-sufficient villages were back then. Quite often, they had everything they needed inside of them and only needed help with the occasional group of bandits. Villages were often spread so far apart that one village could be several days' travel to the next, even on horseback. Back a long time ago in real life, it was completely possible for those in a neighboring village to speak a different dialect or even an entirely different language. Such people may be alien to you. A group of people similar to you, but all their behaviors and mannerisms just being ever so slightly off. They enter your house without taking off their shoes first. Only brutish barbarians do that. In fact, it was likely that it was even dangerous to travel outside of the village without proper escorts. Bandits and wild animals could be lurking on the sides of the roads, quite possibly even in well-patrolled areas, if your reigning lord even gave enough of a shit in order to put patrols in your area in the first place. So back then, it was you, your community, and everyone else outside of that. Anyone who didn't match your community's values and traditions were likely viewed with distrust, or in more severe cases, being xenophobic towards anyone who is not part of their city. The most extreme cases could be refusing all outsiders, like Chaya were when they... let's not say what happened in Chaya.
Nanomachine, son!
But despite all of this, do you still want to leave? This might be more of an irritant if you're an Exalt or an adventurer, but for your everyday peasant, this was an enormous deal. Your entire life was focused in this one small bubble. Everyone you know, nearly everything you know, your role in the community, essentially almost everything that was you. Exile back then was a much, much bigger deal than it is today. It was a death sentence passed on to you that wasn't actually a death sentence. An exiled Exalt might heroically turn his back on the town, hair billowing in the wind as he sets off to seek greater destiny in store for him. An exiled peasant, however, was more likely to be eaten by wolves, stabbed by bandits, or kidnapped and sold by slavers. At least if you're lucky not to get lost and starve to death along the way. Now, there are things far worse than bandits in creation, but we'll get into that later. So you're a peasant who's largely ignorant of the world at large and want to do something other than being a farmer or backbreaking labor for the rest of your life. Despite your fellows giving you queer looks, you decide to forge along this path into higher and other education and career prospects. How do you do this? In this case, your best job prospect was to be joining a guild. By guild, I don't mean the capital G guild that exists in creation. What I mean by guild here is traditionally the same way it was used in our world. A collection of professionals dedicated to a craft. To try and avoid confusion, I'll say the big guild for the big monolithic trading entity that exists within creation, and craft guild for the more traditional type of guild. If you don't know what the big guild is, I recommend reading the Exalted 3rd edition core book or Masters of Jade if you want to know the inner detailed workings of it. Now, craft guilds are a complex entity. They're meant to give protection and empower its workers just as much as it imposes control upon them. Craft guilds are a rough group of professionals that seek to regulate, assist, train, and protect those under them. The craft guild tells its craftsmen what materials are safe to use and they're allowed to work with. They take in brand new apprentices to train and educate them on the craft, so one day they may become master craftsmen themselves. They help other craftsmen by telling them what a good job market price for their work is, and most importantly, they seek to protect these jobs of these craftsmen by imposing a monopoly on them. Is your Twilight turbo crafting masterwork blades for an army while in Nexus? Don't be surprised when the Blacksmith Guild shows up, telling a Twilight to either pay an additional fee surcharge unless he wants to avoid sudden complications. Now some craftsmen, most likely players, are likely to tell craft guilds to piss off. That may be entirely within their right as players to do so. But remember, such a thing doesn't come lightly. Even with the implied threat of violence, there's many other things they could do. The craft guild could place a black mark on you, making it so anyone who does business with you, then the craft guild effectively excludes them from all future business transactions. If the craft guild has ties to a local lord or high-ranking official, which isn't exactly out of the question for many of them, your players could find themselves swamped with so much red tape for their work that many people may just go elsewhere. There's also isolation within the professional community. Who else but a jeweler could understand another jeweler's grievances on the job? By forsaking a craft guild, your life often becomes miserable because you become one lonely son of a bitch. Of course, you may want to be the hermit blacksmith living in the mountains whose works will later become passed down to legend. More power to you. Plus, the craft guild might not even bother with you because of how remote your location is. Such a thing is against the law, you say? Again, what law are you speaking of? Back in the Bronze Ages, universal law and justice were practically unheard of. Such matters were often decided by the people or ruling lord who would deal with the problem in however manner they wished. The only limits on their power were the laws of higher-ranking nobles above them. The concept of what is right and wrong were decided by those purely in power or by religious people. Sure, your lord may be French kissing his horse, feeding it a diet of gold dust-flecked hay will barely meet his quotas, but at least his guards keep you safe from major problems. If you don't like him, then leave. Head out to the wild to be eaten by God only knows what, or stabbed for the clothes on your back. One of the notions we have here in modern law, or even the stories, is the notion that all men are equal before the law. Or even the saying, God made man, Samuel Colt made them equal. Now, as far as I'm concerned, this is true of our world and in reality. But back in the Bronze Ages, this wasn't the case. The king was often said to be a divinely chosen ruler by God. So in this case, then yes, he is your superior and better in every way, shape, or form. The same can be said about the ones he delegates his tasks to. But how do we handle this if we move to a setting where the supernatural exists? A man is placed against beings who are far more gifted than a human in nearly every field. Not just power, but intelligence and superhuman guile and wit. Can this notion of equality we hold ourselves still exist in such a world? I've only scratched the surface of what life was like as a Bronze Age peasant, but hopefully this gets across the idea of how bad things were back then. In fact, despite many of the issues our modern society has, it's still the best time to be living compared to any other point in human history. But how does all the above change when the supernatural enters the picture? I don't just mean being the supernatural, but how does your life change when your next door neighbor is a city god or shiny atomic Superman? The short answer? Pretty damn drastically. Part 3. The Occult and the Supernatural. Now, one major key difference between Exalted and our world is that there is no question that the supernatural exists in the world of Exalted. In our world, atrocities and other events continue to happen until people started asking if there really was some sort of unknown invisible force at work. Judeo-Christian god or other sorts of deities. In creation, there is no question about whenever the supernatural exists. In fact, only a real idiot would declare himself an atheist, decrying gods don't exist, when in fact the city god can appear literally right next to you and slap you in the face for being stupid, then lay a curse on you so you get mugged or beaten up by hobos on the way back to your house. It's similar in Dungeons & Dragons as well. It's pretty hard not to believe in gods when a cleric casts Cure Disease or Raise Dead on someone, assuming you're playing in a setting that has some sort of access to magic in the first place. So rather, the term of being atheist takes on a different meaning in such fantasy worlds. It doesn't necessarily mean that you don't believe in gods, but rather you think the gods are ultimately worthless, or feel there's no need to worship such creatures. Now, most spirits do want worship. In fact, spirits get a far better deal out of being worshipped, unlike exalts. So often, spirits want such worship. Some of these spirits may be happy with worship through just means, such as people thanking their local harvest god and their superior through various sorts of festivals or lower key worship, such as daily prayers, which is really small, but they do add up over time. Now, it is true that if a god of a harvest is killed off, then the field will continue to grow just fine. Maybe something dramatic happening, such as a lower than average crop yield, but if no other god becomes the local harvest god, then the fields continue to grow just fine. So the question is, why do we need such gods in the first place? Isn't it far better not to have one? After all, a pissed off god can curse you, but if there's no god, then there's no danger, right? In this case, you need to think of gods being sort of a insurance policy in the world of Exalted. Now, I'm going to be jumping ahead a bit into the next video, but the relationship between gods and mortals is very complex, in a Venn diagram sort of way. You're going to need to explain one before understanding the other. See, a harvest god's primary responsibility isn't harvesting for you directly. Rather, he helps in indirect ways. For example, if there's an explosion in the population of pests in the area, then it would be the harvest god's responsibility to see if he can talk to the regional god of pests and see if there's a chance that the pest god can lighten up on the activity on his end. If a field suffers damage from beyond a village's control, such as floods or burning down during a rockshell raid, then the harvest god can accelerate the growth of crops to make sure that there's still a harvest in the upcoming season. If there's mutations or curses placed upon crops by outside forces, then it's the harvest god's job to deal with such a thing. In this case, you can think of them as insurance policies for how many things work the way they do in creation. If you worship a lot, he won't fight wars for you. But rest assured, he'll have your back in case some uppity god tries to unfairly alter the weather, or give a little hand by offering powerful magical boons in battle. He won't do it himself, but he will gladly help. This is the reason why people tend to worship such things in creation. The end result is that worship isn't only a form of respect, but tends to make the things you're worshipping stronger. The individual peasant may not know much, but when he sees what very well may be regarded as a miracle being performed by some creature, human or otherwise, giving small praise is certainly the proper thing to do. It's like saying excuse me whenever you do a burp or something like that. If this is kept up on a continuous basis, or said supernatural creature does something significant, then that praise will become ongoing, and at that point a cult will start to form. This is important as supernatural creatures in Exalted are a fairly big deal to your average peasant. For example, do you know how terrifying it is for an average peasant to meet up against even a minor supernatural creature, such as the Blood Ape? Go ahead and run a mock battle between a lowly conscript detailed in the book versus a Blood Ape. I can tell you right now that mortal is going to be torn in half. Hell, even your typical battle-ready soldier is likely going to have his head torn off. I do think the mortals in the book are portrayed far weaker than what the Exalted fiction tends to make them, but the end result is your typical everyday peasant is going to have little to no counter against many of these supernatural powers in creation, even against some of the relatively more weaker ones. The Guild book spells out some very crafty ways indeed for how mortals can get a hand up or exploit the supernatural, but once you start pissing off things like major spirits, it's going to become very complicated. Look, sweetie, I know, you have some money, but no amount of money is going to save you from a pissed off war god or various other curses they can levy upon you. This is why it's best to get on a supernatural creature's good side, or pray to whatever high deity that you may believe in to grant you protection. Despite how terrifying or corrupt a supernatural creature may be, it's often on a mortal's best interest to get on their good side. This is because with supernatural creatures at hand, a person's quality of life goes way, way up. Virtually anything at all such creatures can do is potentially a very big deal to a mortal. Those illnesses that kill often about a third of people, the glowing doctor that came into town can cure such thing as if it were nothing. Bandit raids stealing your livestock or daughters, A friendly or bored lunar will put a stop to that in a jiffy. And just hope that it's your actual daughter that comes back, rather than a shapeshifter. Need a new road? Just ask the friendly Exalt. Just make it absolutely clear that whatever the hell he builds as a road is something that people can actually travel on. You need to be very clear with Twilights, because if they're left to their own devices, then things can get a bit crazy. But not even Exalts, but even gods can help with this. Remember what I said about the Harvest God not intervening unless something supernatural comes up? Hell with that. Bribe the bastard with a larger festival and more dedicated worship so he can use his magic to get better crops. A lot of spirits won't say no to this unless the Immaculate Order are nearby, or maybe the Censor if they're actually doing their job. But such a thing is actually a rarity in the current age of Exalted. In fact, the Censors are even worse. Just bribe them with celestial cocaine until they eventually give in. But all of this and more are a good reason why the realm is so attractive. Even with all the downsides that come with it, the realm is still the largest source of Exalted in the entire world, hands down. Getting a friendly solar, lunar, extant, or whatever the hell out to help you is like a lightning strike. Saying they're incredibly rare is a bit of an understatement. You'd have better luck finding hen's teeth. Keep in mind, there are probably tens of thousands of dragon-blooded, but the number of solars or lunars, they only go into the triple digits easily. And as I mentioned, even if the dragon-blooded are portrayed as the weaker Exalted by many people, they're still an Exalt, and as I mentioned, even minor supernatural creatures weaker than Exalts can make a huge difference on a mortal's life. So yes, asking for the resources for the world's largest Exalted empire can be daunting at times with their blatant demands, but they offer very substantial rewards in return. Not only that, but the realm can call upon a simply huge pool of resources in the time of a crisis. This is why some begin to see a realm satrapi as a very tempting proposition. You not only get actual experienced soldiers to protect your city, but more than likely an elemental superhuman force multiplier to go along with them. All of this for the low cost of increased taxes, dealing with arrogant nobles, and the Immaculate Order constantly shouting at you if you praise your ancestors. I simply cannot stress how big of an advantage any of these are. Living with a supernatural on your side is akin to having services bordering on modern technology as what we have today, right now. There are some areas where modern technology actually lags behind, and some areas where it exceeds that in Exalted. But it's an undeniable fact that the quality of life usually goes up. In Exalted, there are many ways to do this. The realm, powerful celestial Exalted such as solars or lunars, gods, ancestor ghosts, demonic cults, or even the friendly Fae. I use friendly with very careful wording choice. However, each of these tend to have their own baggage. The realm expects you to conform to their standards, and God help you if you miss your taxes. Singular powerful entities, such as solars or lunars, will more than likely see you swept up in their ambitions or whims whenever you want to go along with them or not. Demonic cults involve demons, which are unpredictable at the best of times. Worshipping ancestor cults or gods could involve the ones being worshipping getting an overinflated ego. While the Fae may find your soul delicious, and finding your cabbages suddenly having mouths full of sharp teeth in the center due to some mutations. This isn't an exhaustive list, but it should give you a good idea of the risk versus reward involved in dealing with the supernatural and the occult. This, of course, if the peasant has any understanding of the thing they're dealing with is. Making an informed decision is difficult because, as with most things, the peasant doesn't typically know what they're dealing with in the first place. The supernatural world isn't always clearly understood by the majority of creation. Realistically, how much do you know of the occult? Not your character, you listening to this video. Do you know the details about the Keys of Solomon? Or perhaps do you know the details of the demon Jesus drove out from a person's body named Legion? Even if you know the stories involved, do you understand the occult nature of such things, or their places within the world, or stories and myth? For many peasants, the realm of the supernatural is a scary and unknown thing. Typically, a peasant, village head, or local shaman will only know the spirits within their general vicinity. The harvest god, the city god, and those bears who breathe hurricanes, which you better leave the fuck alone. If pressed to identify things beyond their understanding, then it becomes a little bit trickier for them. A typical peasant will often have no idea how to identify the supernatural, except in very broad strokes. For example, can the peasant tell the difference between a fae and a god? To the uneducated, they could very well appear to be the same, even if one tries to pose as the other. A friendly fae could pose as a god after making crops grow, while a god could be mistaken for a fae if their appearance matches one, or their purview is one of the more esoteric ones in nature, such as stories. A scholar or educated noble might be able to tell the difference more easily, but when either one of them really tries to suss out the details, it could be a difficult task for even the Exalted themselves. For the average peasant, or even a noble, the default answer to interacting with the divine is usually asking your neighborhood priest or shaman to deal with it for you. Such people are often far more educated in knowing and dealing with supernatural creatures in general. Now, knowing about the Exalted themselves will heavily depend upon the area. Any area occupied by the realm, past or present, will likely have information on what a solar or lunar is. Likely, at the very least, they know such creatures glow with a terrible power, manifest signs on their brows, but more importantly, that they are incredibly dangerous and do things such as devour your soul. Such peasants will often take the previously mentioned route, heading to the local priest or shaman as quickly as possible. In places where lunar dominions take hold, in relatively well-established areas, then people may see the lunars themselves as living gods and worship them appropriately. In other areas of creation, people might not simply just give a shit. They'd only know such people under the pretense, such as that glowing girl who cut the city guards up like confetti under the pretense of claiming their birthright or some other such nonsense. The point is, if the shiny girl asks for a bowl of noodles, then you better do whatever the hell she wants and pray she leaves you alone after. And if you're lucky, maybe she'll cover up that bandit camp nearby the village when she leaves. Another reason I consider information to be so inaccurate during these times is often myths emerging in lieu of more refined and detailed knowledge. Myths in the ancient world were ways for others to try and understand and comprehend the world around them with the knowledge currently at their disposal. I'm not saying they're uneducated. In fact, myths can be pretty damn cool. But they were a way for people to explain how some of the bigger parts of the world work, physical or metaphysical. It let people more easily comprehend or make sense out of what is normally incomprehensible. It is, in my opinion, a human's innate desire to try to figure out how something works in some way, shape, or form, at the very least. An example of this could be the television show Ancient Aliens, or even such things as ancient myths. Did Ho Yi really destroy 10 suns with his magical bow and arrows? Or did he use some sort of ray gun in front of a civilization who didn't know what a gun remotely looked like? All they know is that bows shoot at range, and therefore Ho Yi used a bow because he shot the suns at range. The same sort of interpretation could be used in many places in creation. The stories may be true, but the things may be simply false due to lack of understanding for those who witnessed it. In fact, 200 years from now, people might look at the way we understand the world to be filled with ignorance and misunderstanding as well. I mean, we still lack a unified theory involving classic Newtonian physics and quantum physics. Scholars and historians, both in our world and creation, consider such myths invaluable for many reasons. We can learn what a culture seeks to pay attention to when telling stories, what morals such stories instill, and help guide their society. Or in magical worlds, often containing vital clues of how to slay powerful beasts or where ancient treasure may be stored. This also helps infuse the setting with a sense of wonder in the world, discover what these ancient myths actually mean and are addressing. There's a good saying I like to use, not only with the Exalted, but for any setting that involves high fantasy or sci-fi. Make the fantastical mundane, and the mundane fantastical. For example, let's say after taking part in a battle with the Snowwalker tribe in the north, you see Snowwalkers lay pieces of dried meat on the corpses of their fallen comrades. When asked why, you're met with a strange and troubled glare, as if you asked whenever touching water makes one wet. They then tell you so as the wolves who guide the fallen to the afterlife will more easily find their fallen comrades, and guide their spirits to the Hall of Champions, so they may forever be revered as heroes. Oh, of course! How silly of you to even ask such an obvious question. This is an example of the mundane being fantastic, something anyone can do but has a deep meaning behind such actions. For example, another one comes from my home province of Newfoundland, where back in the early 1900s, when children went out to play, they often had bread in their back pocket. Not as a snack, but rather something to give to fairies so one may distract them when running away. An example of the fantastical as mundane could very well involve people interacting with gods or wonders as part of their daily routine. An oasis community in the deep southern desert could very well only exist due to some wondrous first stage machine or ancient man's, providing the townsfolk with clean water and food. A small prayer of thanks going out to the guardian deity of such a man's every day. Or how a brave soul sets off to solve a Raksha's clever riddle to save his village. These are good examples of the fantastical as mundane. As time goes on, all these superstitions and myths are passed down generation after generation, with all the various superstitions and taboos being passed down along with them. Many of these superstitions may appear backwater and just plain silly, but it's important to realize that such behaviors and beliefs were passed on for a very important reason. They were the best way to keep people safe. If such things didn't protect people, then they wouldn't last long enough to be passed on to the next generation. Not because they're silly, but because people wanted to remain safe. For example, back in the medieval period, many parents practiced what was now known today as swaddling. It was a practice of wrapping your baby tightly in bandages for most of the day to make sure the body grew in correct proportions, and not to grow to be something like Slender Man with long noodly appendages. And by tightly bound, I mean your baby essentially looked like a little tiny mummy. In today's modern world, it's seen as a barbaric practice, based on science so flimsy that even a flat earther would look at it as if you're crazy. But if you're living in a town that's close to a wild zone or demesne, then such a thing very well may be a very solid method to protect your village from becoming an area of only Slendermen. Such a thing may seem horrific to outsiders, but for those within the culture, it isn't some dumb tradition. It was a way of protecting yourself or those you loved. Such danger in the world is why humanity and Exalted need the aid of supernatural, or why the Exalted are so important in my humble opinion. Because they serve as a bridge between humanity and the supernatural. Now, I'm a firm believer, so long as one has the courage and the drive to step forth, then a single man can be responsible for the downfall of an oppressive empire or corruption-filled kingdom, or even other many wondrous and amazing things. But Exalted isn't like Gurren Lagann in this aspect. Superpowers in such a world do not come from internal bravery or innate goodness. During your standoff confronting the local corrupt town lord, you could exalt while stabbing him with your pitchfork. However, a normal person has greater odds of being struck by lightning while being bitten by a mutated cobra than becoming an exalt. So, more than likely, the Lord's bodyguard will strike you down while the corrupt Lord decides that fish would be excellent for his dinner tonight. The sad fact is that many people may have the spirit and drive, but they simply don't possess the capacity to take on Fey raiding parties, let alone a Death Lord. The latter of which can kill mortals simply by looking at them. So, for the players to be part of the Exalted, any Exalted, is a fairly big deal in the world itself. As a minor crunch point, if you want to give mortals a little something extra, then go ahead and give them special little merits or special attacks that animals may have. Such skills would be unique to the mortal, non-player characters, and help give them a little edge in areas within their specialty, learned only after decades training, hard experience, or raw talent, or sometimes a combination of all of them. For example, a heroic hunter could have enhanced sight or hearing within the forest locale he hunts in on a daily basis, while a local lord could treat everyone in the area as having a minor intimacy towards him in some form of loyalty, willing or unwilling. If the players ask about such abilities, then tell them they have charms. An in-lore reason would be that when Exalt does their charms, they're merely doing an action with essence flowing into them. These moral techniques are often transformed into charms automatically. Plus, on the crunch side, it would be an utter bitch to balance such things. Well, that's all I have to say about how mortals work and fit in a Bronze Age world, but how they interact with the various supernatural elements within it. Next time, we'll finally be discussing the various types of spirits. We'll go over the various types of spirits that exist, how they differ, and how each one plays a certain role within the world of Exalted. Until next time, take care! Part 4. Supernatural and mortal interactions within modern and sci-fi Exalted settings.
Surprise, motherfucker!
And now for something completely different, partially because it's so underexplored. What role does the supernatural have in an otherwise modern or science fiction based setting? This is a very loaded question to ask, and the exact answer basically boils down to it depends on the setting. However, I can give some general thoughts on how such a thing would be the same in most settings. Now, people new to Exalted might be wondering what I'm even talking about here. Well, back late in the second edition, there was a book published called Shards of the Exalted Dream, inside of which contained alternate settings to play Exalted inside of. These are not the only ones I know of, however, as I've seen many other people play Exalted within modern-day Earth or in the Exalted vs. World of Darkness book. In fact, I myself made a fan-made book for the space setting known as Heaven's Reach, expanding 30 or so pages in the Exalted Shards book to over 300. Now, I know some people may spit at such ideas, claiming that literally the entire point of Exalted is the current setting, and by removing that, there is no point in playing Exalted otherwise. Then we disagree. If you want, you can turn this video off now. Otherwise, I'm going to delve into this a bit more. Before we start, the game on screen right now is Shanghai Genzo Network, a Toho version of Mega Man Battle Network. It's still in production, but it's still an outright amazing game. I can't wait to play the completed version.
Denied.
Oh, it was cancelled. Whoever said we have nice things in this world is a fucking liar. So let's go ahead and ask some of the questions we've asked in this video already within this new context. First question, what do people do in such worlds? The answer is simple, look outside your window. We don't need to go much in depth regarding this because most of us should already know from personal experience what a modern day world should look like and be like. There's no need to drill it inside your heads of the vast differences between our modern world versus something like a Bronze Age world. And for Sci-Fi, I wrote nearly a 300-page book on that, so I don't think I need to go in overly much detail here about that either. So that leaps directly into the modern version of our Part 3 section. What role does the supernatural have in a modern world? In terms of most things, the same things they do in the original Exalted, just with a different coat of paint. Technology is one hell of an equalizer. Thanks to modern day practices, we can cure illnesses that were fatal centuries ago, weather forecasting is more accurate than an oracle, and modern agriculture techniques allow us to farm larger crop yields with less labor than it took in the past. While it is true I believe the need of spirits are less essential in such settings, they are very much welcome when the supernatural starts happening and when things start to rapidly go south. Humans can only mitigate so much, and when we can spray our crops with pesticides to ward off pests, it might be a different story altogether when the local pest god sends a supernaturally toughened plague of locusts down upon your crops. Which in this case, you might need to fight fire with fire and get the harvest god back on your side to deal with this. Or just call your friendly neighborhood Exalt on speed dial so they can punch the pest god in the face until he cuts such crap out. Another more famous and oft-debated part is that of Combat Spear. The original creator of Exalted, Grabowski, never released stats for firearms in the first edition of Exalted. He wanted people to play within the world of creation, but by introducing guns to it, people would automatically try to process the tech level and ask questions such as, how many assault rifle rounds do you need to take down a war god such as a Lot? Let me ask you another question instead. How many arrows do you need to take down a Lot in the default setting? Guns may be easier to train in fluff, but in terms of mechanics, guns are not going to be the great equalizer as they are in our world. If you need an example, go ahead and look at the game Metal Gear Revengeance and tell me how effective assault rifles are on Raiden. If anything, they're more of an annoyance that slowly chips away at your health. This does make the gun nuts rage, but I do so enjoy feasting on their tears. But how do we handle knowledge of the supernatural in a sci-fi or modern setting? And how do we keep a sense of mystery in a world where virtually everything can be looked up online in a few seconds? The answer is simple. Not everything is going to have a direct and simple answer immediately. Take, for example, many of the bosses within the Metal Gear Solid franchise. With how many of them have borderline supernatural, if not blatantly supernatural powers? Does Psycho Mantis really have psychic powers, or is it him just going through incredible lengths to mess with you and Snake's head? How does Vamp freeze your movement just by throwing a knife at your shadow? With all the stuff in the beginning, is he actually a vampire? And how do you even begin to describe the Sorrow in Metal Gear Solid 3? Until such events are explained, you're often left utterly baffled. It's a sense that something like this clearly shouldn't exist in the world, but it's happening right in front of you, your very eyes, right now. You have no idea how to explain it, but in the end, you're left to deal with it immediately. Even when you continue playing, some things are still ultimately left unexplained. Or in the case of Metal Gear Solid, sometimes you wish they were left unexplained.
Nanomachine, son!
And don't think the internet will be the one-stop shop for help either. Do you have any idea how much of a telephone game exists on the internet? Or rather, how to swim through a literal ocean of information in order to get what you want? Or the websites that contain such information being part of the dark web? That might mean that you need to get the links for such websites from people who trust you. What if there are bogus dead ends and false information scattered around the internet just to confuse and misdirect you? Want to become a sorcerer using the quick and easy method you found online? Sure, go ahead, become that internet sorcerer. Just be careful that when you finally do the practice summoning left in the instructions, make sure that they're actually complete instructions, so the demon doesn't escape and kill you. Or if the demon isn't already under express orders to kill anyone who performs said summoning ritual upon them. In this case, you're not only challenged to find the information on your given subject, but quite possibly needing to find the correct information. Plus, anyone with a PhD is likely going to know far more than what's on a Wikipedia page. Now the last and quite possibly the most important question. What is the purpose of the Exalted in such settings? As I said, technology is one hell of an equalizer. Whenever you have weapons such as nuclear bombs, how can your native charms even compete with such destructive power? In this case, I think you're looking at such a thing from the wrong angle. First off, perfect defenses exist. They are anything that can block infinite, otherwise known as incalculable, damage. Your average Exalt can pretty easily learn to laugh off a nuclear bomb for the low cost of a Heavenly Guardian defense, and it's probably something I can see all Exalted doing eventually later on in their lifetime. Even the Dragon-Blooded can probably do this with some effort. Another way of seeing this is that the Exalted are more akin to pulp heroes in such settings, rather than the superpowered demigods of the original. Yes, there are some pieces of technology that may lay the pain on them, but they're hopefully pretty rare. Yes, a nuclear bomb can be made by a Twilight if he has some spare plutonium and use pinball machine parts. But remember, Exalted is a game about consequences, first and foremost. So go ahead, make that nuclear bomb. Not only do you do incredible damage to everything around you, making actually protecting anything really troublesome, but a Shadowland is more than likely going to form with a near absolute certainty, or an irradiated wasteland at best. But worst of all, you're likely going to be put on the shit list of basically everyone for being a lunatic detonating a nuclear bomb. But look on the bright side. Rebuilding all those destroyed buildings are a great source of craft XP. But lastly, and far more importantly, there's the core theme of Exalted I feel transfers over into these other settings. The Exalted being the big damn heroes of the world that can not only do something, but actually make a difference in the world. You may have waves upon waves of men at your disposal, but your character is the Tony Stark who made that power suit. The Dr. House that found the treatment for the brand new supernatural disease. Or the loose cannon cop that takes on an entire criminal empire. There may be more people in the world, yes, but in the end, you're still the big damn hero that saves the day. To me, a lot of things do actually change, but the core of the game still remains the same. Being big damn heroes in a world that needs saving. Or just overpowered superhero wish fulfillment. Take your pick. All this and more is detailed within the Shard book I made, Shards of a Compass, Heaven's Reach, as a mini essay. Go ahead and download the PDF if you want to read my thoughts in more detail, or look at the online Google document if you want to see hundreds upon hundreds of grammatical errors. I'll leave you to decide which one to view. Well, that's all I have for this episode. For real this time. Next time I will go over actually discussing all the various types of spirits within creation, their various types, their roles, and likely a bit about religion in the realm of creation. Well, that's all I gotta say now, guys. Take care.